Well, good morning, everyone. It's a right cheery passage, that. Don't worry, next week is much worse, so it's pretty bleak. Thanks, Karen, for reading that. I wasn't sure whether we were going to read it, because at some point it's just a big list of names and a whole load of numbers, and eventually you begin to fall into this kind of like, what's going on? But I actually think it was helpful, and hopefully we'll see why. So just to give you a quick recap, last week we were in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, we read the story of Cain and Abel, and most particularly we focused on the fact that the story's not actually about Cain and Abel, but it's about Cain and Seth. And it's the line of Cain and the evil that comes from that, and the line of Seth that comes from that. And so we looked at this image. So we see that we'd been talking before in Genesis 1 to 3 about this great hope that God gives us, which is that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the snake. And we saw that Cain had transferred from being the seed of the woman to the seed of the snake. Seth comes, and his people come to worship. But Cain's, through particularly Lamech, is the pinnacle of this violence and ignoring of God's will and God's desires. And so he takes multiple wives and he murders people and thinks that he is invincible because of a blessing that was placed on Cain, and he claims it for himself as much larger. And this was really about whether or not he's going his own way or whether he's willing to trust God. And the trusting God side comes from Seth's family, and we see that chapter 4 finishes that at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. And then we go into this story of Adam's line that we just read in chapter 5. Now, I'm going to be honest, this section from chapter 5 to 6, verses 1 to 8, I actually think this is the most challenging part of Genesis that we've dealt with up to this point. So all the other stuff about how was the world created and what was going on and all of this, what was going on with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, all of that, easy, simple, super easy. And you all understand that all perfectly now because you've been sat here for weeks doing that. This part is, I think, really difficult. And poor Karen's had to put up with me all week basically going, I don't understand this. What's going on? And usually you just put a bit of work into these things. And that's the gift of the Bible, is the opportunity to wrestle with things. And suddenly we see more or we know more. And all week it just felt like I was in a fog with it. So I think I have something to share with us this morning. But I am confessing my weakness to you. This section, well, actually the two sections, so chapter 5 and then that first 8 verses of chapter 6, along with what went in chapter 4, are a hinge in the whole biblical narrative, I think. They function as a hinge, a pivot point. And that's a pivot point between chapters 1 to 3, which were this great story of creation, of God's goodness, of the way that God put the world together, of the calling of humanity to be co-regents or rulers with God in this world, humans as made in the image of God, created in relationship to God, to others, to self, and to the earth. And then that story told us, of course, that desire for self-autonomy became the way that caused a rupture in those relationships, all 4 of them. And that led to banishment from the Garden of Eden, from the presence of God, and especially from the tree of life. That's chapter 1 to 3. That's where we left that. And then next week, we're going to start looking at chapter 6, which is the flood, right? Now, most of us know the flood story, and it's Noah. He builds a wee boat, and then he gets some wee animals, and they go in 2 by 2. Everybody remember that story from Sunday school? It's a brutal story. We're not doing the Sunday school version next week. It is horror. It is absolutely terrible. And so we've got this story here, and this story here, of the flood and of chapters 1 to 3, that story of creation, and then the breaking of that. And then chapters 4 and 5 in this first part of chapter 6 sit in the middle. And they're like a pivot point, because we don't go straight from banished from the garden to the flood and destroy it all. There's something in the middle. And that's what's here. And I think we're supposed to see it like that. And it has 3 distinct kind of movements. So the first is what we did last week, chapter 4. Story of Cain and Abel, but really the story of Cain's line and the violence and destruction that comes from that. This week we've got Seth's line, and we've already talked last week about what that would look like, that they are pious and they want to honor God. And then we get this third scene that's part of it, which is, well, we'll talk about it in a bit, but it's a bit bizarre. I mean, there really isn't a better way to talk about it than to say it's a bit bizarre. And I've got the news for you is that as you do more reading about it, it gets no less bizarre, but there is hope in the midst of that. And I think I'm going to give my conclusion away. I'm going to tell you what the point of this is now, so that if you get lost in the middle of it, this is the bit that you want to hold on to. This hinge section is supposed to, I think, let us see the depravity and destruction of sin among humans, Cain's line. The wider disintegration of the moral fabric of the universe, the sons of God and the sons of and the daughters of man having children. And then in the middle we get this one little hopeful piece, which is that there still exists those who would worship God, and that's Seth's line. Or if I put it differently, this is a depressing tale of destruction and distancing from God. All those who look and see what is good for them take it, and then there are destructive consequences as a result of that. In the background, there's a quiet thread of hope that in the worship of Yahweh, there might be a solution to all this destruction and desolation, which sets us up for the coming of the flood narrative. That is, I think, what this hinge section is about. So let's dig into it and see if I'm actually right. And I'm perfectly happy for you to disagree with me by the time we get to the end. I should say, we promised we were going to do a Sunday lunch one day. So a bring your own lunch where we'll talk about Genesis. We did this during the first section. Bring your questions. Really helpful if you send them in advance. So on Sunday, the 15th of February, when we draw this to an end, we will have in the cafe anyone who wants to come. We'll share some lunch together, and then we'll chat through any questions that you have about this section of Genesis, or indeed any of the parts, because by then we will have finished all 11 chapters of Genesis. There are another 39, but don't worry, we're not doing those. We're going to pause here. So in this genealogy, what do we find? Well, there's 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Follows the same structure. Basically, it says this person was born, this person had children, this person died. Right? That's what goes on in there. And it follows the same structure. There's this undercurrent, this drumbeat of and they die, and they die, and they die, and they die. That's a really important thing for us to notice, because we're being told something there. Death, remember, is a consequence of the fact that they ate the tree from the apple. God says, you will surely die. And so the writer here is helping us remember that sin has consequences. That even in this line of Seth, even in this line that is pious and holy, still the echoes of the garden's sin comes through. Drumbeat, boom, 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 and they die, and they die, and they die, and they die. So, the question everyone in here is wondering is, so what about all those old men, right? Like, just pick a random one. Kenan had lived 700 years, or 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Kenan lived a total of somebody can remember. 910 years. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that with all of them. Kenan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. Anyone want to live 910 years? Well, I've got good news for you. You're actually going to live forever. You give your life to Jesus, you're going to get to live forever. You're going to beat that. But what's going on here, right? We've got to be honest and say there's something here. What is it? What is it? And there are all sorts of people. There are basically three, in the end, solutions that people propose for what we do with this. The first is do they live this long because of the lingering effects of eating from the tree of life? So Adam and Eve ate from the tree of life, and that lingers in their kind of genetic predisposition, and so they get to live longer. Option 1. Option 2, is this actually the opposite? So it's the incoming effects of sin that mean that that it's having a more and more significant effect on their bodies, and so therefore they'll they begin to decline in age to where we are today, where we get to live however many years we get to live. That one actually doesn't work for me, because if that was what we were supposed to see, one would assume we would see a declining number of years through the generations, but we don't. Are the numbers symbolic? So the numbers mean something. And there are certainly one or two that we could make that case for. So, for example, Enoch lives for 365 years. 365, the kind of solar year. Is there something significant in that? And maybe there is. But the problem with assuming they're symbolic is that you don't just get to pick one or two and say they're symbolic. You'd have to actually deal with them all. And so that begins to prove to be really complicated. So I'm not convinced of that either. And then the other thing that we must realize is that there's a thing called the Sumerian king list, okay? So I'm sure you're all reading that before you go to bed at night. But the Sumerian king list is a Mesopotamian, Babylonian scroll tablet that was discovered in the 18th century, but it's dated from in this kind of a space, okay? And at the same time, they found a thing called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which some of you may have heard of, and we'll talk some more about that next week. But the Sumerian king list lists off all the kings. There are 10 of them. The 10th one is supposed to be the one who saves the people out of the problems they're in and builds the great city of Babylon. Okay, so it's the same story. But they live for 26,000 years, 42,000 years, 18,000 years, 37,000 years. They're quite a lot more than 900. In actual fact, one of the theories is that these numbers in here are so low compared to what people would have known in the culture, the kind of song that was being sung in the culture, the water they were moving in. When people wrote these lists, they went, this person lived for thousands of years, and this one lived for even more thousands of years. And actually, they come in and they go, lived for 900 years, and they died. They lived for 700 years, and they died. What's the message? Well, the message is something about death is profound and significant. Death has an impact. We are humans, not godlike creatures that live forever. Death comes. Death is part of the story. This is who we are. And you have picked up, I think that's the most plausible option for these numbers, is that they don't particularly in and of themselves mean something other than they're actually describing something entirely different than the cultural expectations. It is also possible they actually lived to this age. I wouldn't want to rule that out. I think it's possible that that's the case. I think it's more likely a literary device to make this point. And they died, and they died, and they died. The effects of the sin in the garden and the promise of death are real. But, and there are some big buts in this narrative. The first one is, of course, the wise and careful listening among you said, but Glenn, they didn't all die. Isn't that what you were thinking? Enoch does not die. And so because we have this repetitive pattern, born, had sons, and they died, born, had sons, and they died, then that what we expect, or when we see something that is different, then we must pause and have a look at that. Because it says here, verse 19, after he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years. And then he died. He must have been tired. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. No death. Not he died. He walked faithfully with God. Well, we're only a couple of chapters removed from them walking with God in the garden. This is clearly what we're meant to begin to think about, a relationship of intimacy. Elsewhere in the Bible, this idea is used to talk of two friends together. It's an act of devotion, that Enoch was committed to the Lord, that he knew him intimately, that he walked with him. This is who Enoch was. And yet, he didn't die like the rest. It says God took him. We'd already read about God taking one human person. He took Adam from where he made him and placed him in the garden. Do you remember that? Back in Genesis chapter 2. It says he took him and put him in the garden. And the beauty of that is he put him in the garden, which is where God was. He put him in his presence. And the same thing is happening with Enoch. He has been taken and put in the garden, in the presence of God. Taken from the wilderness into the garden. Death did not take him from this world. God did. And friends, for those of us in Christ Jesus, death does not take any one of us. Jesus does. We are taken to the presence of God, not taken by death. We could look in John chapter 5 and see what Jesus has to say about that. We could look in John chapter 11 and see what Jesus talks about that. We could look through Paul's letters and see the same story being told over and over and over again. Death will not have the final word in our lives. It will not take us. It will not take us. This is good news because God will take us. John chapter 5, verse 24. Let me just read this for us. Very truly I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but has crossed over from death to life. This is our hope, friends. This is our hope. That death will not take us. We'll be here. People will be telling stories and they'll say, Duncan, he lived a great many years. He did a great many great things. He had children. They did a great many great things. And he went to be with God. This is not the story of, and he died. This is not our story. Our story is, God took him. We are Enochs. Our challenge is to live like him, I think. Lamech is the other guy I want to mention from this. We talked about a Lamech last week. If you were here, Lamech is this great evil guy in the line of Cain. And then there's a Lamech here in the line of Seth. And what's interesting, it's the only two places in the Bible that name is used. That name has no meaning whatsoever at all. I said that last week. But if you invert the Hebrew letters, so turn them the other way around, it spells king. So it's like a king backwards. And we said last week, that's quite interesting. Whether it means something or not, I don't know. But the fact that the guy who set up the first city and took control and took violence was a backward king, may be interesting. Or maybe not. I don't know. But the fact there's a Lamech here, I think we're meant to contrast them. And the Lamech that we have here has a son named Noah. And Noah means comfort or rest. And that's why when Lamech then says, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands, that's the consequence of the fall. That's what God says. You will labor and you will toil in the ground. It's going to be hard work. And so even in this holy group of people, they are still struggling with the problems of living well on this earth. Friends, when we struggle on this earth, when we encounter difficulties, we should not be surprised. That is the reality of life in this world. But Lamech hoped for Noah, a rest in the labor and the toil. And so comes Noah. And I'll say more about Noah in just a second. Lamech in chapter 4, he presumed on God's promise. He said, Cain was covered 7 times, I'm covered 77 times. Lamech in chapter 5, he trusts in God's promises. He trusts that there might just be a seed of the woman. Maybe Noah could be the one who will bring rest from all this painful toil. That is what his prayer, or what his hope is for this son named Noah. So that brings us up to Noah. We put this slide up. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it. Let's have a look. Yeah, just about. What I wanted us to see from this is that actually we shouldn't, these are not consecutive, okay? So it's not like Adam lived and then Seth lived and then Cain lived and then Mahalalel lived and Jared and Enoch and so on. But actually what we see is that they lived consecutively. So they lived at the same sort of time. Does that make sense? One of the most important things to note is that none of them lived through the flood. Methuselah dies the year of the flood and does not go through the flood. None of this line go through the flood, which is interesting, huh? Obviously, Noah goes through the flood because he has to get in the ark and all of that stuff, but all the others before Noah. The other thing I think that we can see from this that is useful, I should have done another line in there. Noah is the first one born after the death of Adam. Adam dies, and then Noah's born. Noah is this new humanity, this new expression of what it might mean that God might provide redemption through humanity. And at the end of chapter 5, where we find Noah, we discover that Noah also was one who walked with God. So, that takes us all the way through chapter 5, and then suddenly it cuts away to chapter 6. How are we doing for time? Right. I'm going to do this quickly. Cuts away to chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. Frankly, the weirdest scene I know of in the Bible, and there are loads of them, right? There's a bottomless pit of stuff in the Bible where you go, what on earth is that all about? This one is right at the top. We have these sons of God who saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And they had children, and these children were presumably known as the Nephilim. We think, I've made a leap there, but I'm going to say that that's the case. What do we do with that? So first of all, we have to ask, who are the sons of God, right? That's the right way to tackle this. Who are these sons of God? We know who the daughters of humans are. That's women, right? That's fairly straightforward. Who are these sons of God? There are 3 options. The historic, right up until the 2nd century, understood by Jewish people and the earliest Christians, they just said sons of God are angels. That's the typical use of that language. These are angels who have decided to come and have children with women. I told you it's a bizarre story. That's option 1. Option 2 is that they are, that sons of God is sometimes used in the Bible to refer to kings. And so these are kings who've decided that the women around are beautiful, and so they take them to be wives. I'm not entirely convinced by that one. And the other is that the sons of God, because of where it appears, is in reference to the line of Seth that we've just been reading about in chapter 5. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that that's an entirely convincing argument either. And so we're left with 3 completely unconvincing arguments, which isn't terribly helpful to you. But I think it does begin to point us towards the fact that we can skip past that a little and say, okay, we don't know exactly what this is. It might be people from the line of Seth and they were marrying with the line of Cain, and that was what was going on, and it shouldn't have done. One possibility. It's possible they were kings who were taking power and taking women as they pleased, which maybe, and we can see why that wouldn't be great. Or it's angels who've come down and done their thing, and that's where we are. Again, I'm like, I don't know. What is the point? Why is this story in the Bible? Because I think we're supposed to see that this, whatever it is, whichever of those three options it is, or another one that I haven't contemplated or understood, is that there's great evil involved here. That there is unbelievable evil here, enough that God despairs. My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal, or that word can sometimes be translated as corrupt. For they are corrupt, their days will be 120 years. And again, why that's 120, we don't know. There's a great evil that has greatly distressed God, and we will talk more about that next week. Because God's reaction to this is profound, right? Adam and Eve get it wrong. God is just and carries out his just judgment. Cain murders Abel. God is just, carries out a just judgment. In both those cases, there was mercy, right? In this one, God is just furious, it seems. I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. We will talk more about this next week, because I have been disturbed by these verses. And I think we're supposed to be. Friends, I think we are supposed to read this and go, what on earth? We don't get focused on whether it's the line of Seth or it's angels or it's whatever. It's the God who made everything good, very good, is so distraught by chapter 4, chapter 5, and this first part of chapter 6, this hinge, so distraught. He's like, stuff it. I'm going to wipe it all out. I'm done with them. The evil that's being done, I think we're supposed to see, is so grave that God, when he looks at it, this statement is a balanced judgment. We're not supposed to think of, now, none of you have done this. None of you have done this. I, however, in the bringing up of a beautiful little child and a daughter, I have had moments of incandescent rage that are utterly unrelated to the level of action taken by my beautiful little daughter. None of you have ever experienced that or even thought like that, and I understand you're all much holier than me. But I remember when Zoe was little, one occasion in particular where, and I have no idea what she did, I can't even remember, but I was apoplectically angry, to which Karen said, you should leave the room. That's a pretty good sign that I have lost the plot at that point. I'm very grateful we had made the decision not to physically discipline our children, because at that point, that would have been a dangerous moment. I was incandescently angry. And I can tell that there are at least one other person in this room that feels like that might have been something they've experienced. Why am I talking like that? Because that is not what God is doing here. That is not what God is doing here. God is not just incandescently angry because he thinks, I've had enough of these people. Instead, it is a balanced judgment. It is about justice. This is the proper response to what has been done, the great evil that humans are doing, the continual choice of the thing that will give me power and autonomy versus choosing to trust in the goodness of God. It's the story of the tree. It's the story of Cain choosing his own way rather than choosing God's way. It's the story of Lamech, of choosing evil. It's the choice of the sons of God to be with the daughters of humans. This is the evil that God is saying, enough. And so Walton, one of the commentators, says this. He says, this does not suggest that God is without emotion or feeling about what he is doing. It simply suggests that his action is motivated by his sense of justice as he properly weighs the situation. And he compares it to what's written in Daniel 5:27. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And so I think we have to take that seriously. Friends, sin matters. It matters to God. That it has a consequence that we sometimes feel in the now, but it has a much bigger consequence. I warned you it wasn't a cheery, happy message. But it matters. Our sin matters. And we're not the church that stands up very often and says, you are a sinner in need of the rescue of Jesus. That the purpose of Jesus' death on the cross was partly as a substitution for our sin. Those things are true in the Bible. And that is true today. Our sin matters so much that the God of heaven and earth had to send his Son to die for us because our sin was so significant. And if the story ended there, it would be bleak. But the part that Karen read finishes with this. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so once again, in the midst of righteous judgment, God offers mercy. He offered it to Adam and Eve by not just killing them, but by banishing them from the garden. He offered it to Cain by not killing him, but offering him the opportunity to find a new life and a new way to go as a wanderer. God offers mercy in the person of Noah. It's bleak. It's dark. There's pain. There's anguish. There's awful sin. There is the abuse of power. The powerful take advantage of the weak. I'm describing the biblical story, but I could be talking about the BBC News front page. But there's hope. But there's hope. This hinge section is supposed to point us to the depth of human depravity. And yet when we choose God, when we choose to trust God, there is hope. This is not just an idle thought, not theory that comes from Genesis. This is our daily lives. We have a choice. We will walk with God or we will grasp for control on our own way. We will launch out on our own to build a world around ourselves like Cain, or we will call upon the name of the Lord and walk with God, the Seth type. It's the choice in the New Testament as well, because Matthew writes Jesus' words, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Friends, we need to find that road. This is the choice of discipleship. Which road will we follow? But the good news, because that might not be good news, because you might just go, I can't find the narrow road, and if I can find it, I'm pretty poor at staying on it. That might, again, just be me for the avoidance of doubt. Good news is, though, that rescue and salvation, they came from out with. You see, we just read a genealogy, and we could have spent ages talking about what the purpose of genealogies are, and there's lots and lots and lots of them in different cultures. This one here tells us, though, the line of the seed of the woman gets to Noah. From Noah, we're going to get Seth. From Seth, we're going to get Abraham. We're going to get through all the patriarchs, and it winds up in one place. It winds up in Jesus. That's why Matthew and Luke both start with a genealogy, because this story needs a completion. This story needs some way for the hope to be fulfilled. Jesus, he is the answer. He is the gate that we are to go through. He is the only place that our hope will make any sense. In the midst of the darkness and the chaos and the pain of this world, our hope is Jesus, friends. It's all we got. That's all that we have. I'm going to leave a moment of quiet in part so I can put my guitar back on, but there is a much more profound part. I want you to sit and have a think. Sin matters. The good news is Jesus came and died that your sins may be forgiven. What do you need to ask God for forgiveness this morning? And be promised He will grant it to you. And then we're going to stand together and we're going to declare our hope in this God who can make all things well. Okay. Just take a moment of quiet. I'll pray and then we'll leave some silence. Father God, we thank you that in the midst of a story of evil, destruction, that there is faith, that there is hope, that there is life, and that in you there is both justice and mercy. Help us to see where we have gone astray. Help us to see where we need to ask your forgiveness. And grant, Lord, grant to us the ability to recognize the forgiveness that you have poured out on us through Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen. Take a moment.